Hello everyone, in today's video I am going to be reacting to this guy's reasons for moving back to Windows from Linux. I will link the original videos in the description so you can watch them in their entirety should you wish to watch them later on. So this is Cameron, and Cameron has been using Linux for 3 years, and in general he seems to like it, and there are many things that he likes, but he's decided to move back to Windows. And he lists his reasons, and he's very calm, he's collected about those reasons. It's a measured opinion. It's not a rant in any way whatsoever. And he's not saying how bad Linux is and how great Windows is. It's just a nice measured video of this is what I liked about Linux, but this is why I'm moving back to Windows. So Cameron started using Linux after a challenge by Linus Tech Tips, and the challenge was to try Linux for a month, and he never left until now. He had other reasons for trying Linux, such as Windows bloatware and the romance of using open source software. And I think these are reasons many of us would give for trying Linux out, and of course we hate Windows updates. He fell into the same trap as many of us by trying out lots of distributions over the 3 years. For instance, he tried Pop, but he didn't like GNOME. He then tried KDE Neon, and he did like KDE, and so he went on to Manjaro KDE, and then Garuda, and recently Nobara. If you watch a channel like mine and you see me review loads of distros, and I provide lots of installation guides for distros, then there is that FOMO thing about where you were worried you might miss out on something, and therefore you might switch distros, and you might think switching distros will solve all your problems. So Cameron's expressed many reasons for moving back to Windows. One, he's bored of Linux, which is a bit of a strange reason, but fine. 2, GIMP sometimes crashes when changing text color. DaVinci Resolve doesn't work. Discord won't share the screen, and if it does then the audio doesn't work. Kdenlive struggles with larger projects. Counter-Strike has performance issues, and he's never fully understood the Linux folder structure. So they're Cameron's reasons for leaving Linux. They're not wrong. If that's his reason for wanting to use Windows over Linux, then fine. Linux isn't for everyone. So part 2 of that video is Cameron's pal Ando, and Ando is given a counter-argument for using Linux. Ando argues that the amount of choice with Linux means you have to work a bit harder to resolve some issues, and that you have to kind of use the terminal, because I think I've expressed this in the past as well, is that if you've got lots of people using different desktop environments, and it's hard to come up with a guide showing how to use it with one desktop environment and then another desktop environment and then another desktop and then another desktop environment, etc. It's easier showing one command in a terminal than showing 3 different ways via GUIs. So that's Ando's argument, where Cameron could have helped himself in certain circumstances. Ando also said there's a general lack of support from hardware and software companies when it comes to Linux, which is why some software doesn't work, some hardware doesn't work. I don't want to dwell too much on Ando's arguments, because this is where part 3 comes in, and it's the counter argument to the counter argument, and it is fairly brutal. So when it comes to the argument about expecting Linux to just work, he says, of course you do. If you buy a car, you expect it to work. And he repeats this point throughout his argument, that you want it to work, it should work. If it doesn't work, I'm going to use something else. And that's mainly the crux of his argument, is that you can't blame Cameron for going back to Windows if Linux isn't doing the things that he wants it to do. He then says Linux should be less fragmented, and you don't need 10,000 distributions, you only need 2, and that choice isn't a good thing. It'd be better to make one thing work. I will come on to that later on as part of my own rebuttal to that. And then he says, with regards to terminal usage, the terminal hasn't really been relevant since the 1990s. No one wants to use a terminal, and he says it's an outdated piece of shit. His words, not mine. He then goes on to say there's nothing wrong with expecting things to just work. If you spend 30 minutes a day fixing your setup and not working, then your boss isn't going to be happy because he's paying for that time. And it's true. I mean, there's an old adage that comes back from the 1980s. No one ever got fired for using IBM. Now, at the time, IBM were the largest computer manufacturer in the world, and so a lot of companies used IBM because if you use IBM, then it's kind of a safe house to be. In the same way, lots of people use Windows because using Windows is a safe place because it's Microsoft. No one's going to argue with you using Microsoft. With regards to hardware and software support, he then says, well, why should companies pay to make things work on Linux? It's their money, it's their time. It has to be profitable for them to do it, and it's up to Linux to give them a reason to do it. And then finally he says what every Linux developer should be doing is taking notes as to why this guy is leaving Linux and fix it. And so here we go. This is going to be my rebuttal to his rebuttal, or the rebuttal to the guy leaving Linux or Windows. Okay, do you follow that? So it's me arguing against the guy that's arguing against the guy who's arguing against the guy. You know what? You're never going to be able to make everyone happy. Cameron had valid reasons for moving to Windows, and that is fine. Linux is about freedom. Of course, one of those freedoms is not to use Linux. It happens. That's why I have Windows content on this channel as well as Linux, such as how to remove Linux and how to fix USB drives and how to create Windows VMs. People aren't always going to want to stop using Windows just because you say use Linux. It doesn't work that way. My channel is about encouraging people who do want to use Linux and to aid them to get the most out of it. And if I help one person, that's great. That's what my aim is. I'm not here to be a Linux evangelist. If you don't want to use Linux, that's fine. That's up to you. Did you know the most popular video on this channel is about Wi-Fi drivers? And it has over 90,000 views. And that video is about Wi-Fi drivers on Linux Mint. So Linux Mint is one of the most popular Linux distributions, and 90,000 people have had to ask, how do I get my Wi-Fi working with Linux Mint? Now, this doesn't mean Linux doesn't work and Linux Mint doesn't work. It's an educational thing that if you install Linux Mint, you might need to install additional drivers to get your Wi-Fi working. For a lot of people, Linux Mint does just work, and when they install it, their Wi-Fi will work. But clearly for 90,000 other people it didn't. Now if you think Linux Mint is an outlier in this, well, I've got a Debian video about Wi-Fi drivers that's had 20,000 plus views. I've another video with 10,000 plus views about how to get an Xbox controller working. So a lot of the videos on this site are going to be people asking, how do I do things using Linux? That doesn't mean Linux doesn't work, by the way. That just means that people are actually wanting to get things working with Linux. So it doesn't just work, but it does just work. Windows doesn't just work. I've had hardware issues with Windows in the past. So case in point, it's virtually impossible to get Windows to print using my printer. Linux connects and prints fine on nearly every distro that I install. Now, I say nearly every because nothing's perfect. The argument about the 10,000 distros is a tricky one, right? So some people will agree that 10,000 distros is too many, and by the way, I don't think there are 10,000 distros, a few hundred maybe, maybe 1,000 at most, and most of those aren't really relevant anymore. I think sometimes the trouble we have is that we lump everything under one term, Linux. Okay, so everyone thinks there's 3 operating systems: Windows, Mac, and Linux, and that's not really true. So imagine a high street where there are only 3 shops, right? If you went to a high street and there were only 3 shops, or if you went and you wanted to eat somewhere and there are only 3 types of food, okay? So there's a chip shop, Indian and Chinese, okay? Is that a good thing or is it a bad thing? Or is it better to have 100 choices? So as long as each one provides something unique and has a unique selling point, then it's going to survive. If it doesn't, or it's rubbish, or it becomes irrelevant, then nobody's going to use it anyway. So in truth, I would imagine the vast majority of Linux users use the same 4 or 5 distributions, but there are many reasons to use different distributions. In his admission, Cameron, who was moving back to Windows, stated he wished there was a Windows Lite, so Windows without the bloat. And off the top of my head, I can think of a dozen reasons to have multiple distributions. So the first one is rolling or fixed release. Okay, some people want to continuously update their operating system. Some people like to keep it the same and just update every 6-12 months. Cutting edge or slow and stable. So do you want a cutting edge distribution like Arch, or do you want a slow and stable, steady like Debian? That's 2 reasons. 3, do you want lightweight distribution for older machines? And number 4 would be, some people want every feature there is possible to have on their distribution with every single graphical effect that, like the cube windows and all that sort of stuff, all the composite stuff that you get, that cubes and flashy images, etc. So there's that. Number 5, some people want to completely customize their system. Whereas number 6, some people want their system completely locked down so that you can't customize it. Some people only want to use containerized software. Some people don't want to use containerized software at all. Some people want a distribution that's optimized for gaming. Some people want everything installed on the system for them to start with, every single type of program. Others want something minimalist where they can then choose what they want on their distribution. And finally, some people want things that run on different devices, like ARM devices. So that's a dozen reasons to have a distribution, just off the top of my head, without thinking about it. When it comes to lack of support for hardware and software, I get the reasoning that if a company has to create drivers for Linux or make their software work on Linux, then they want rewarded for their efforts. And that is understandable. And I think one thing leads to the other. More adoption to Linux means larger user base, making it more worthwhile for companies to provide a Linux offering. But it's a gradual thing, and it's been getting better year on year for a while now. And things like gaming have improved considerably, and hardware is so much better than it was 5 years ago. And I remember 20 years ago when I first started using Linux, it was almost impossible to get any hardware working. So here's where I think Linux is right now, and what I think the major issues really are. I see many videos by YouTubers who have created videos stating, I tried Linux for a week or a month, and they state their use cases, and many state why they can't use Linux. And for a lot of them, it's because they can't use things like DaVinci Resolve. The thing is, they are all YouTube content creators. They need a video editing suite that works for them. How many people out there are truly video content creators? And you get the same argument about Adobe products for creating thumbnails, and that they don't like GIMP and things like that. But how many people are truly using those products in real life? Now, personally, I love Kdenlive when it comes to video editing. I do use GIMP, but I'm fairly bad at it. And I know my use case isn't typical of everyone. If we really look at it, everyone uses their computers for different things. And I reckon you can serve 80% of computer users with desktop Linux without any terminal usage required. That's 80%, right? Does that seem high? Well, if you consider most of the users in the world are people who use social media, they write emails, they visit websites, they watch Netflix, they look at family photos, they maybe do their family tree, they do a bit of financial planning. I think that covers a large proportion of computer users, which is why this channel is about everyday users, because the everyday user covers a large proportion of the computing world. The trouble is, a large proportion of those people have never had the inclination to install an operating system. They probably don't even know what Linux is, and they might not even know of its existence. Chromebooks and Macs have shown people that there's a world without Windows, but it hasn't shown them a world with Linux. Younger people are more tech savvy, and I've seen an upsurge of demand between 17 and 30-year-olds to this site. But guess what though? Those 17 to 30-year-olds don't fit into the 80% of typical computer users. Sounds weird, right? But 17 to 30-year-olds, a lot of them like to game, for a start, whereas the older generation probably don't necessarily like to game. That's being a bit generalistic, but it's probably true. I know my mum would never be a gamer, for instance, but then she's also never going to install Linux. She's probably never going to use a computer, to be fair. Gaming on Windows is still better than gaming on Linux. That's not a lie, it's fact-based. Linux is getting better, but it needs to be better still for Windows users to use Linux for gaming. And a lot of the 17 to 30-year-olds are now creating content. And we live in a world of content creation. That means video editing, photo manipulation, Lightroom, DaVinci Resolve, Photoshop, all those sort of tools need to work or have a really good alternative for Linux. So Linux is great. It's great for many reasons, but now it needs to specialize and target the audience that is really going to adopt it. It's great for software development. Hands down, Linux is better than Windows when it comes to creating software. And I'm not talking about desktop software per se. I'm talking about things like web APIs or web applications, orchestrators, language models. things like that. It's fantastic. It's great for software developers. And for people like me, it's fine for video editing. But I'm an amateur, I'm not an expert at video editing. To be honest, my video editing skills could be summed up in a 3-minute educational video. It clearly doesn't do what Cam and so many other YouTube creators want it to do, so it needs to improve. Linux is growing and it is getting better year on year, so don't worry too much about the odd person leaving and going back to Windows. But it is worth understanding why they are leaving. So I agree with the guy that said take notes as to why that person's leaving. But you don't have to throw the baby out with the bathwater and change everything. Just make it gradually better over time. You need to care enough that Linux remains relevant so that it stays alive. But other than that, what difference does it make to you or I if Cameron uses Windows or Linux? If Linux works for me, then I'm going to use it. It's up to you to make up your mind if it works for you, and it's up to Cameron to make up his mind if it works for him. It's not for me to say that Linux is for everyone. It's not for me to say Linux is for you or for anyone. If you want to use Linux, then great. And that's really the end of the video. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you for watching.